Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about how to set up some user settings and customize your Bash experience. There are lots of things you can do here, and I can't cover them all, so I'm going to really cover the basics of the setup. And then that leaves it open for you to explore kind of what you could do differently in your Bash system. So I'm back on Atu now. And as a reminder, I mentioned that there's this idea of the user, and so you can figure out who you are. And I showed you that each user has a home directory. So each of you will have your own home directory. And there are actually lots of useful files in here. Mine has a bunch of the files that I've used throughout my years here. But in fact, there's actually some hidden files too. So as a reminder, all files that start with a dot are kind of hidden files. And this is where usually you put a lot of the configurations. So you can actually see I have a lot of dot files in. Now, the two I'm going to talk about today are these two called Bash Profile and Bashrc. These are the two kind of files that let you customize kind of what you want to happen whenever you start up a new Bash shell. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and edit my bash profile. And you have to remember the dot in the front because the name of the file is .bash profile. And you can see that actually my bash profile actually immediately just sources the bashrc. I'll explain later what's the difference between the two. In some sense, there is no difference. That's why I source one from the other. They're just ways of configuring. The big difference is when they get run. And I'll explain that later. But you can go ahead and do something like echo, and I'm going to say hello hunter. Save this and quit. Now, your bash profile and bashrc are things that get run whenever you log in. So whenever you start a new shell, if you logged in. So nothing happened right there. I changed this bash profile, but this only has an effect the next time I log in. So if I log out and then SSH back in, you could see kind of right above my prompt, it printed out a lot of extra output, so I had trouble seeing it. It's printing out a default message, but it prints out hello hunter. So this is the thing that gets run kind of whenever any startup commands you want. And you could see that these things can get particularly complex. So bashrc is another one. I guess I should just mention this now because I think it'll just get confusing if I wait. So bash profile gets run every time you log in. So whenever you SSH, bashrc gets run whenever you start a new shell. And those two events aren't always the same. So you might have saw in a previous week, I was using that program called tmux to get like the split window. Those aren't new login shells. They're just new shells because I was already on the machine. For the most part, that's a really weird and kind of archaic difference. There's no reason you'd want them to behave differently. And that's exactly why in my bash profile, I just source the bashrc and then I just use the bashrc as kind of the source of truth for all the things I want to happen at startup. But this does allow you some flexibility in setting things up differently if you want to, between when you log in and when you don't. And you can see that these bashrcs can get fairly complex. So you can see that this came with some provided stuff from CSE where they source like this global bashrc for some sane defaults. I showed you earlier this alias, I think this was in a class session. I'll talk more about this alias thing, but I actually have in my bashrc lots and lots and lots of commands for things and settings that I like on my system. A lot of these things I stole from the internet. I didn't complete or stole or borrowed from the internet, I guess. Things I didn't come up with from scratch. But whenever you want to change something or customize something on your system, it's almost always setting up the bash profile or bashrc. A lot of other programs like Vim or Emacs also have ways to configure them. I don't know about Emacs, but Vim also has a vimrc or a .vimrc in your home directory. So this is a very common pattern. So these kind of files in your home directory is usually where you'll find something if you want to configure a particular thing. Bash profile and bashrc are the most common ones that you're going to use on your day-to-day. So let me show you an example of when you might actually want to edit one of these things. So, kind of by habit, I think a lot of programmers are fairly lazy by nature, meaning that whenever we don't have to do something, we try not to, especially if we can like write a program or a command to do it for us, right? We have this superpower to let the computer run something for us. Why don't we use it? Now, one of the things that's like kind of annoying is, in Bash or Linux, these commands you type can sometimes be kind of long. Like for example, if I want to CSE or CD into the 391 website, I have to like type CSE web courses CSE 391. Oh, whoops, typo, and then 20 autumn. And this takes me to the like 20 autumn directory. This is actually the file or the directory where we host all the website files. So you can see there's this like index.html, which has all the code for the course website in it. Now, I do this kind of frequently, and so it's kind of annoying to have to type that out every single time. And so Bash has this notion of an alias. You can make an alias for something, so you can save yourself some typing later. What you do is you type alias, and then you give it a name. So I'm going to call this alias 391. And then you put in quotes the command you want to run. So I'm going to do the cd CSE web courses CSE 391 20 autumn. Now, whenever I type the 391 command, I've kind of in some sense made a new command that just executes what I typed there for me, which is really, really nice. Now, a couple things I should mention about aliasing is first, the format is very particular. For example, you have to put quotes around the command out that you want to use because you need to like tell Bash as like, oh, treat this string as a command. And you also have to use this equal sign without spaces on both sides. So no spaces allowed there. So you usually will get weird syntax errors if you try to alias something incorrectly. And so just make sure that you type this out correctly. The second thing I want to point out is this is a relatively limited feature, meaning when you alias something, it only works for commands. So you can own this 391 is in some sense like a new command in that I can type in my terminal, but nothing else. So I can't do something like cd 391. I can't treat it like some kind of directory name. It only works as a command itself. Next week, we'll talk more about how to make variables in Bash when we talk about scripting. But right now, we don't know how to do that. So this is only making kind of a shorthand for a command. The last thing I want to mention about this is aliases are temporary. So if I were to log out and log back in again, I no longer have my 391 alias. When you alias something, it only works in the current shell. And so if you have a command or you have some kind of setup that you want to persist throughout logins, that's what you edit your Bash profile or Bashrc for. So I'm going to edit my Bashrc, and I'm going to add an alias for 391, and I'm going to type in cd CSE web courses CSE 391 20 autumn. Notice it's the same thing I would have typed in my shell. In fact, your Bashrc is really just a bunch of single commands to type into your shell at startup. And so it's basically going to run at the startup of the shell. It will run all those commands for you to kind of set up the system in the way you like. And so now this didn't have any effect. There's still no 391 command because it only takes into effect if you log in again or start a new shell. One shortcut to do this without having to log out and log back in is you can always source one of these files, and it's just going to run everything inside of it. So now this kind of reran all my setup, and now I have this 391 command that exists. So that's Bashrcs and Bash profiles. So a lot of what you do there is kind of set up aliases that you like. Other things might be setting up kind of certain directory settings or anything that you might have there. I did mention already the kind of difference between Bash profile and Bashrc. It's okay if that's not the clearest thing. Honestly, it's a bit weird that we have those two different files, but it's just convention. And so kind of having a setup where you source one from the other is a great way of kind of keeping your setup simple as possible. So the other really common thing that you set up in your profile or your Bashrc at startup is this thing called the path. So the path is a special, I'm gonna go back to my home directory. The path, and actually go CSE 3, extra 8. So the path is kind of a way of determining which commands get run and if a command exists. So when you type in something like ls, you might have been wondering kind of how does it know that ls is a command and ls isn't? So how does it know what a command is? And where does it find what program to run? This is what the path is for. So we'll talk a little bit more about the semantics of updating variables and what variables look like in Bash. But path is a variable. We'll talk about that more next week. But what you could do is you could use the echo command. Echo is kind of like a print statement in Bash. And you can echo this path variable. And what this does is it prints out a big, long, nasty looking string. And it actually has this well-defined structure in it of a bunch of things separated by a colon. And those things that are separated by colons are paths to directories. And these directories are the places that you store the actual command programs. So this, whenever you type kind of ls or whatever, it's actually searching through your path from the beginning to the end, searching for if any of those directories contain the program name that you just typed. And if it does, it runs this. I've kind of put together a little bit of pseudocode to kind of explain this. So whenever you execute a command like ls or grep or whatever, it goes to this path variable and kind of goes to each directory separated by these kind of colons. And if it contains a file that matches your command, it then runs that file. Otherwise, if it gets through the whole thing without finding anything, it will then say command not found. Now, a couple things to mention about this. The process that Bash uses behind the scenes is very similar to the one I just showed here, which means that if you have multiple copies of ls, it's always going to run the first one it finds according to this path. So starting from the first one, going to the last. And if it gets to the end without finding that command at all, it then prints command not found. So that's what happened when I typed that LLS. This is one way that you can set up like local installations of things. You can add your own programs to kind of a path that you control, that you have access to. I'm not going to dive in how to do that, but it's an interesting thing to look into. Now, this does mean in some sense that if you have a longer and longer path, that your running programs is slightly more inefficient because it has to search through more things. That is only sort of true because computers are really freaking fast. So having one or two extra things in your path is not going to hurt in the long run. And usually kind of setting it up in kind of a sane way at first would mean that the path isn't longer than like 20 or so things. So it's basically to search that path. And another thing to note is it doesn't do any like recursive searching. So when you type in this kind of this path thing, it's searching in CSE courses, CSE 451, 17 Autumn, bin, x86, 64, soft MMU. That's the first directory it looks in, and then it looks in my home directory for other things. But it doesn't do any recursive searching. So you have to kind of enumerate all of the directories you want to search for. For the most part, you don't have to edit this path unless you want to add a new location for it to search for. You can see that the first thing in my path is this thing for CSE 451 operating systems. This was probably from when I was taking operating systems. I wanted to use the command that they provided in their kind of system setup. And so I added it to my path as their instructions said. So you'll usually just find instructions online or for courses that say, oh, add this thing to your path. And that's what it's doing. You usually add it your Bashrc to say, hey, Bash, whenever you're looking for something, also look here for this command because I have this other place that has command I want. This path thing could be a little tricky. And so I want to start us practicing kind of one problem to get us thinking about how this path stuff actually works. So I have this problem here where I have two files and I have my path set up like this right now. What happens if I type hello.sh into my terminal? What does it print? Take a minute and try this on your own. Okay, so let's take a stab at trying this together. So I mentioned that the path determines a list of directories to search for whenever you type a command like hello.sh. Now, it always starts from left to right. So it first starts in user home, and it looks like I didn't show you if there was a user home hello.sh. Now, that's okay. If it doesn't find it, it just moves on to the next one. And so the second thing it's going to look at is user bin. And there is a file called user bin hello.sh, and so it's going to run howdy partner. Even though we have this other hello.sh in this sbin directory, there's lots of directories in Linux systems that mean slightly different things. This one won't get run because it always searches from the path from left to right. If you really wanted to run this specific instance, you'd have to fully type in user sbin hello.sh to specify that's the pattern that you want. So there's that. So that's profiles and setting up this path, which is a very common thing you'll do in your Linux system. And now, even though I didn't show you a lot of the specific things you can do, I think this opens up a lot of doors. Because now this kind of, if you're looking at guides or looking at blog posts that show you how to set up something cool, you now know the terminology. Oh yeah, I could just add that to my Bashrc or my bash profile. Or, oh, I know what this is doing when it's modifying the path. So it's more of enabling you to do kind of whatever you're interested with this stuff later on. Now, I have one more video for us where we're going to talk about permissions, file permissions, which is particularly important in these shared Linux environments.